Yeah, it's a warm welcome to everyone to this, which will be discussing about agriculture and conservation soaring birds along the Rift Valley. This region is actually very important in terms of migratory species, and about 1.5 million birds actually use this region to cross between Africa and Eurasia. And I'm very happy to host everyone on this call. My name is Alex Ngari. I work for BirdLife. I'm based in Nairobi. And we have a couple of guest speakers who will be helping us to analyze the issues, to of agriculture and especially pesticides, and basically how the region is doing in terms of managing agriculture and biodiversity conservation. So if I can give a little bit of a background about agriculture and migratory birds, is that agriculture as a sector indeed is very important for the countries within this region. And to just give a glimpse of how the sector is important for some countries is, I'll give an example of Ethiopia, where the sector is actually the foundation of the country's economy, accounting for half of gross domestic product and about 84% of exports and 80% of total employment is actually based. Crossing on the other side of the Red Sea, for example, the sector is the third most productive in the country after the tertiary and industrial sectors. It contributes about 3.6 of GDP and employs about 4%. It's not a lot of input to the GDP, but it's a substantial amount. So in Sudan, is contributing 27% of the GDP and employing a bit of workforce in Sudan. And looking at Jordan, we have about 25% of Jordan active population being involved in agriculture and food sectors. Yeah, so really the sector is really important for this region. And what is that we've been witnessing increasing intensification to increase productivity in the farms. And with increasing intensification, you get a lot of farmers and the players, using agrochemicals, particularly pesticides. And in the region, there is a lot of times concerted efforts to control pests such as the armyworm and red-billed quelea, and also red. Find a lot of governments really placing a lot of effort to support the sector. And therefore, when all this is happening, therefore birds, the migratory species, are put into big risk. And a lot of times you find that whereas there is regulation and control of pesticide use, in many instances, the enforcement mechanisms for their control are wanting. So in today's webinar, we are very honored to have 3 speakers. We have Simon Krimowa, who is an international consultant in UK. We also have Dr. Tadessa Amera. Dr. Tadessa is the co-chair of the International Pollutants Elimination Network. He's a member of board of directors to the International Environmental Communication Association, a board member of Ethiopian Wildlife Society, Wildlife and Natural History Society, sorry, and also the director of Pesticide Action and Nexus Association. And our third speaker for our webinar today is Dr. Stoyan with Bulgarian Society for Protection of Birds. He's a national wildlife partner in Bulgaria. But before we can actually welcome our first speaker, who will be Simon Krimowa, I want to welcome Shannon, my colleague, to make some announcements. Then you can go to the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. So just quickly before we jump into the webinar, I just want to say that you'll notice that when you join the call, your cameras and your microphones were turned off. So if we could please keep it that way during the call, that would be really good, keeping in mind that some people have limited bandwidth and having our cameras on can slow that down. There'll be time as well during the call for some question and answers based on what the presenters have said. So during that time, I invite you all to put any questions you might have into the chat, and then we'll answer those. We're going to try and channel all the communication from the participants into the chat. And then this call also is being recorded, so it'll be available afterwards, but just so everyone knows that we're recording this course and it will be up on the Migratory Soaring Birds website afterwards. And I think that's everything, Alex.
Thank you very much, Shannon. So without further ado, I'd welcome Simon to share with us her talk, which is about guidance on agriculture and conservation of migratory soaring birds in the Rift Valley Red Sea Flyway. And actually, this webinar is happening project which BirdLife is implementing.
Thank you, Alex. I'm really happy to be here to share some more information on the guidance, which some of you may be familiar with. But essentially, I'll just quickly give you a run through of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the purpose of the guidance, as well as give a kind of high level overview of the guidance, so the key impacts and recommendations. And then talk through some of the developments and progress to date in the international context. My colleagues, Stoyan and Tadesse, they'll probably go into a bit more detail, but my talk will be quite a high level. But please do, if you have questions, put them into the chat box, and then I can address those later on. Okay, so to start off, so the purpose of the guidance is to highlight the risks associated with agriculture on migratory soaring birds in this very important flyway, which Alex mentioned that, there's 1.5 million birds that use this flyway, and to provide key recommendations for how to kind of minimize and manage those risks across the flyway's main countries. So some of you may already know, but BirdLife has developed this guidance a few years ago through the support of the GEF UNDP. It's just one of the tools that's available to kind of address the risks to MSBs. So we know that in nearly all the countries in this flyway that land under agricultural use and irrigation are on the increase, and therefore migratory birds are increasingly at risk. And when we were kind of developing this guidance, we focused on identifying solutions that delivered protection for the most at-risk birds, benefit a wide range of species, because we know there's quite a lot of diversity across the Flyway, and it can be applied to in a way where we've got regulatory and kind of non-regulatory approaches as well. So it's intended, the audience for the guidance is intended for it to be applied at the community level, also for industry, so pesticide companies, conservationists, and of course government. So just a quick little interaction between the participants. So I think it would be really helpful if everyone can share one of the bird species in the chat function, using the chat function, that are most at risk in your area. So I'll continue on with the talk, but just to kind of have a bit more interaction, I think it would be useful if people can just kind of share a bird that's they're most concerned about in their area or region, using the chat function. Okay, so the first bit I wanted to talk about was the impacts on birds from the protection of crops from pests. So this is pesticides, of course. So some of the kind of key impacts here are, we see chemicals used, and of course they're ingested by birds, and that causes lethal or kind of sublethal impacts, which then have effects on the breeding abilities of the birds. There's sometimes the chemicals used are particularly highly toxic to birds, particularly those used for kind of locust management. Bird poisoning has occurred when birds they go directly into contact with the poison, or they're feeding on a contaminated insect, for example. Cultivation, so some types of crop types demand the use of chemicals. Other crops are kind of less intensive than a need for chemicals. And there's a time that chemicals are harmful to birds and can be applied to determine exposure and the extent of kind of the subsequent poisoning. There's a persistence of chemicals in the environment, and the implications as well. So in terms of how long the chemicals last in the environment, if they're longer lasting, they can have a greater impact and more likely for birds to come into contact with them. And then some of the kind of key recommendations that are in the guidance. So I think it's particularly important to look at what the alternatives are. So what are the kind of substitutes? Are there alternatives available for pesticides that are particularly toxic to birds that can be used instead? And the guidance kind of makes some recommendations around that. Applying an integrated pest management to change kind of cropping strategies and reduce pesticide use is one of the key ways of achieving this. Harvesting pests such as quelea, using best practice to prevent and manage rodent eruptions, and one of the key things as well is restricting second generation anticoagulants, particularly in open field agriculture, which we've identified as one of the major risks to migratory birds. Creating restricted pesticide zones in high risk areas. So we know in migratory bird kind of bottlenecks or particular areas where they kind of congregate in large numbers, or even particular times that farmers could avoid using pesticides because it's a key point in the migration pattern. And then prohibiting practices that would kind of permanently expose birds to poisoning as well. So that's a very high level overview. Tedesse will kind of go into a bit more detail and provide some kind of practical examples around poisoning to birds in his region. So second thing I want to talk about is the impact on birds from protection of livestock from predators. So this is probably something that you're all familiar with, and is one of the most common sources of human-wildlife conflict that we know of. So poison baits, they're a very widely used predator eradication method. Farmers and kind of landowners, you know, set out baits for a number of predators, and you can see on the slide there's examples of these. So some of the recommendations that we've kind of suggested as part of the guidance is looking at alternatives for addressing human wildlife conflict, looking at the root of the problem, and putting in place measures such as predator-proof enclosures. Guard dogs have been shown to be quite successful. And I mean, there's a bunch of different methods that can be applied. I think education here has a big role as well. So it's about raising awareness, having the right laws in place against the use of poison baits, improving land use planning within the area, as well as the long-term means to discourage poisoning. And it's provision of compensation as well, and or kind of insurance schemes that farmers can contribute in where there are cases where animals are taken by predators. So that way they're kind of discouraged from using the poison baiting to prevent attacks. Establish effective monitoring enforcement mechanisms. So this is, you know, where government comes in. There has to be that kind of monitoring enforcement for any kind of laws to be effective, and you need to establish consistent product removal policies. So where you've got obsolete, highly toxic chemicals sitting around, and of course there's various schemes underway in countries to address this at the moment. But I think it's about kind of targeting those for the high risk areas to migratory birds. You want to kind of promote regional collaborations because, you know, the nature of migratory birds need to work across borders on this stuff. And again, you just kind of want to prohibit any kind of permanent baiting as well, because that's the most dangerous. And then that's all I kind of wanted to say on poison baits. But Stoyan, I think, is going to cover a little bit more detail on this in his talk later on. So the third area I want to talk about, which is the use of veterinary pharmaceuticals for livestock. So diclofenac and other type anti-inflammatories are used to treat livestock, and these can have lethal effects for birds who may then feed on the carcasses of the livestock. So there has been, you know, a lot of kind of evidence about the impacts of these particular pharmaceuticals on soaring birds, and they can have different levels of impacts across different species, but I think one of the key things is in the past has been that there just hasn't been the appropriate testing on these pharmaceuticals on birds before they're kind of released as kind of standard veterinary drugs available. So that's led to kind of diclofenac and other drugs being used that are highly toxic to birds. And I think the licensing schemes and everything need to kind of are in the process of being reviewed or need to be reviewed to address this. So again, some of the recommendations for these impacts are looking at, you know, how do you assess and monitor the use of veterinary drugs in your country, in your region? How do you dispose of livestock carcasses that may have been treated with these toxic pharmaceuticals. And that, you know, if you remove the carcasses, you definitely reduce the risk of exposure to scavenging type birds. And again, there's another recommendation about replacing diclofenac with a less toxic NSAID, and particularly for kind of veterinary use for domestic livestock, and introducing kind of mandatory safety testing of NSAIDs on birds. All right, I think that's it on that one. And then one of the other, obviously we're talking about agriculture today, so one of the kind of big impacts on birds is the agricultural expansion and intensification. So this is something that this Flyway and a lot of other parts of the world are really affected by. So the population sizes of birds in this region could be limited, or with severe competition at the fewer stopover sites that are available, resulting from agricultural expansion. So then there's often a lot of competition for food and supplies, which can get very depleted. There's a risk of increased mortality of birds who do not have an available kind of stopover point to support them on their kind of migration. And we've seen this in a few studies. There's the suitable habitats, as we know, are continually being encroached upon, and this is particularly seen in wetlands. So the irrigation and maintenance of kind of sufficient water resources, and just the wider kind of ecosystem functioning has been particularly at risk. Soaring birds again can be affected by a reduction in food supply related to if you're using chemicals and pesticides, and obviously the insect population is reduced, so there's reduced food supplies available to the birds. Livestock grazing can also affect prey availability for raptors, especially those reliant on rodents in grasslands. And conversion of agricultural fields into monocultures can reduce the availability of diversity and abundance of food sources as well. So some of the things that we've been looking at, the mitigations, include, and I won't run through all of these, but some of the key things have been preventing water pollution by minimizing impacts on runoff. So you can use buffers and things like alley cropping. Obviously, strategic environmental assessment is really important. Landscape scale conservation, making sure that your kind of statutory bird criteria is put into environmental impact assessments, and habitat connectivity through farmland is really important as well. In looking at overgrazing, sustainable land management practices should be used, and I think as well looking at reducing the use of herbicides and weed control systems should be looked at as well. And of course, there are kind of impacts on monitoring and compliance, so environmental legislation and kind of cross compliance measures. So you're looking at the system as a whole, are really important. So that's all I want to cover on that one. And then just quickly, I wanted to run through some of the key developments of what's happening in international context. So the Convention on Migratory Species, so it adopted the guidance preventing the risk of poisoning to migratory birds. So that wasn't so much agriculture focused, but it did include pesticides used in agriculture. And they're looking at setting up a preventing poisoning working group. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, or you know of any funding available for that, please do get in touch. There's the CMS COP also adopted a resolution on insect decline and its threat to migratory insectivorous animal population. So again, that's related to the impact of pesticides on loss of insects and therefore food for migratory birds. And there's been a vulture working group put in place, which is the implementation of the African Eurasian vulture multi-species action plan, which again was adopted at CMS COP in 2017. And that covers diclofenac, NSAIDs, poison baits. So that's a very quick run through of what's happening in the international context. But if you do have other questions, I've included my contact details and Nicola Crockford as well. So she's Principal Policy Officer responsible for Convention on Migratory Species for the UK and BirdLife Contact. So you can get in touch with her directly. She's happy to field any questions. But thank you very much for your time, and I will hand you back over to Alex.
Simon? Yes, I'm sure people have learned a lot, and that's coming. And remember Simon's request, but in that you might be aware of, I suppose, for your region. So our next presenter will be Dr. Tedese. So you have you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tadesse. I'm from Ethiopia. I'm going to present the issue about pesticides in birds from the experience we have in Ethiopia. The outline of my presentation will be what Pan Ethiopia is and what it's working. Pesticide use in the Ethiopian Rift Valley, why we focus on pesticides and birds, the negative impacts of pesticides in different aspects, and if there are also ways to mitigate pesticide impacts. Just to highlight you about what Pan Ethiopia is. Pan Ethiopia is an NGO working in Ethiopia to prevent the negative impacts of pesticides and other hazardous chemicals in Ethiopia and beyond. I say in Ethiopia and beyond because we are also involved in many international chemical convention arenas. So you see these pictures at the bottom. The first one is pesticides, which I will cover mostly in this presentation. But the second one that you see is lead in paint. Pan Ethiopia raised the issue of lead in paint in Ethiopia. For the first time, we presented our studies to the government, and a policy, a national regulation which limits lead in paint is already ratified. For those of you who may not know, Lead is a heavy metal which is really poisonous, and children under 6, if they are exposed to them, they will be damaged irreversibly. And that will be difficult also for the kids to cope with learning and with other social issues. The other picture that you see is electrical and electronic equipments. This was also an issue which Pan Ethiopia raised for the first time in Ethiopia. We did a study on the gravity of the problem in Ethiopia. We submitted it to the government. And now Ethiopia has a national regulation which regulates the import and disposal of electrical and electronic wastes. And it has also the first product-based extended producer responsibility. So to give you some highlights also, Pan Ethiopia is a participating organization of the International Pollutants Elimination Network, and representing Pan Ethiopia, I'm one of the 2 co-chairs of IPN, which is a membership of more than 500 NGOs in more than 125 countries worldwide. Pan Ethiopia has an observer status at chemical conventions at a UN level, the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste, Rotterdam Convention on International Trade of Pesticides and Other Chemicals, the Stockholm Convention on the Management and Control of Persistent Organic Pollutants, Minamata Convention is on mercury, SICAM is a strategic approach to international chemicals management, and the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the highest environmental decision-making body in the world. We do also have consultative status at the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. We are board member of Ethiopian Wildlife and Natural History Society. And the main work that we do is we globalize local problems. We are implementing at grassroots level, as you see, for example, the pesticide issues. We have activities at grassroots level. We have engaged ourselves in agroecological approaches, and the problems that we see at local level, we take them to the global level in negotiating the international chemical conventions. And when there are agreements internationally, we localize those international policy frameworks to national regulations like the lead paint and electronic waste. And we take them also to grassroots level, like the agriculture sector that I'm going to present. The pesticide use in the Rift Valley of Ethiopia is haphazard. From these pictures are taken by me from the vegetable production of Central Ethiopian Rift Valley of Central Ethiopian Rift Valley. In this area, you can see a mix of pesticides with no protective device, kids and young guys and women also mixing pesticides at different levels, and they are using it haphazardly, and all the weight ground and the trousers and the hands and everything that you see is full of pesticides. And this is the way pesticides are being used, even from a human health perspective, on all the biodiversity and environmental aspects. The pesticide use, when we see in the Ethiopian Rift Valley area, the main usage that we came across is from smallholder farmers using cocktail of pesticides. They mix different types of pesticides, unmixable fungicides with herbicides and insecticides. By pesticides, we mean all types of pesticides, including rodenticides. And in the Ethiopian Rift Valley area, there are many flower farms. And these flower farms, considering that flowers are non-food, non-feed, they are using highly hazardous and the effluent is going out to water bodies, soil, and air. And workers in those areas are also highly affected. The other, which is directly linked with birds, is the aerial application of pesticides for quelea control. These are migratory birds who are coming every year to Ethiopia, and there is a yearly application of aerial application of highly hazardous pesticides that are meant to kill birds. The other application in the Ethiopian Rift Valley is aerial spraying of pesticides to control locusts. And this is even from the time that I know, the highest application of locust control pesticides are being used in Ethiopia and eastern part of Africa this time, because they are really rampant at this time. And even at this moment in time, aerial application is being conducted. The other application of pesticides, not really so much, but very highly poisonous, is a pesticide or some chemicals used for rabies control. In Ethiopia, for rabies, not other animals, but dogs are the culprit. And when there is a suspicion of rabies epidemic, the Ministry of Health is handling rabies control by killing dogs. And the chemical being used is called strychnine. It's very highly hazardous chemical, even for human beings. You can use only 4 milligrams of mixing it with meat and giving the dog, and it kills the dog in less than 2 minutes. It's highly hazardous. By the time you see, when the meat is in the mouth, the dog just perishes. And in this case, the main protective measure to protect birds and other wildlife is to bury the dogs immediately. Otherwise, the problem of vultures and other animals will be very high, and it is seen sometimes in some areas. The session of today is on migratory birds and birds in general, and linking them with pesticides on agricultural issues. But there are even more reasons to focus on birds, because birds are the best environmental indicators. Before publications came out about the impacts of pesticides on human beings, it was first known that pesticides were affecting birds. And the pioneer for the current environmental movements in the world is the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. And the popular quote is this one, which I projected on your screen. Rachel Carson is known mainly by this quote because she was going every spring, she was going to a riverside and she was listening to many birds. But at one time, there were no sounds of birds and it was just silent. And when she studies, the birds were affected by DDT and other chemicals, and the birds' eggs were thinned and they couldn't perpetuate, and there were no birds in those areas, and it was a silent spring. And that was the main turning point for environmental movements in the world. So birds are really the best environmental indicators, and we, if you see birds around you, if you see birds in your surrounding, you feel that the environment is okay and even okay for human beings to survive. When we come to negative impacts of pesticides, the first one that I would like to show you is the impact on biodiversity, on water and soil and air. The impact on microorganisms and invertebrates is the one, especially for birds that are dependent on invertebrates, migratory birds in some cases when we see in the Ethiopian Rift Valley area. These are some of the issues that affect also migratory soaring birds that are roosting in the Ethiopian Rift Valley area. And pesticides also make the decline of bees and many pollinators. And if pollinators are declined, food production cannot survive. And pollinators are the main reasons for food production for more than 80%. And if we there was even one say that humans cannot survive without pollinators, but pollinators can survive without human beings. So this is one of the issues. And in Europe, bee declining chemicals are the main arguable issues at European Union level even. The other is impact on birds. How direct application of pesticides like quelea control or locust control or agriculture. For example, in some areas there were aerial application of cotton fields that also affects birds. Polluted environment from the air, from water, from soil, and from their food as well, from invertebrates and grains. They get pesticides, and it was well presented also by Simon from the first presentation. These are the main sources of pesticide poisoning for birds that affect even the migratory soaring birds as well. A colleague of us from the Ethiopian Rift Valley area in the operation of quelea control operation in 2013, because we were presenting issues of pesticide impacts on birds together with Ethiopian Wildlife and Natural History Society in our joint to the Darwin Initiative project. The guy from the Ministry of Agriculture took his camera and he was taking the non-target birds that were affected by the quelea operation, and these are some of the pictures from the effect of that control in 2013. With regards to human beings, there are different cases. So dermatitis is the first one which affects the skin, but you can also see the mutation and which affects also. These are the physical things that we see, but you can also see hydrocephaly and different types of carcinogenic effects in human beings. These are from the chronic effects, but majority of the farmers are affected with also acute effects, and there are thousands and thousands and millions of cases of acute impacts of pesticides on human beings. Is there a way to mitigate pesticide impacts? That's one of the questions that can be raised. Yes, Pan Ethiopia is working on agroecological approach to mitigate pesticide impacts, and one of the areas that we are working on is in southern Ethiopian Rift Valley area. And first we started with integrated pest management with cotton smallholder farmers, and we applied organic, locally made, environment-friendly pest management options. And the farmers decided to convert to organic after looking at the options that we presented. And now we have more than 3,000 farmers in that area producing organic cotton and stopping the use of all types of pesticides. And these farmers are now producing organic cotton. I say cotton because majority of the pesticides produced worldwide are used for cotton pest control, because cotton is highly attractive to pests, and it is called museum of pests. So if you control pests in cotton, you can manage pests in other areas. But we also use this experience, and we bring this experience to the central Ethiopian Rift Valley area, where pesticides are being poured. And from the first picture that I showed you, the young kids are really affected from spraying of pesticides. And now this is our third year of using organic options and integrated pest management approaches in central Ethiopian Rift Valley area for vegetable farming. So the farmers are now cutting the use of highly hazardous pesticides in this area by 70%. And through time, we are trying also to convert these smallholder farmers into organic farming. So there are options also to first minimize and ultimately stop the use of pesticides and mitigate the impact of pesticides on biodiversity, environment, the bird population, and ultimately to human beings as well. So these are the options that we have also been using. And on this, together with Ethiopian Wildlife and Natural History Society, Pan Ethiopia had a 3 years project on agroecological solutions to mitigate impacts of pesticides on birds. And we documented many issues, including residue analysis of sediments from Lake Zawai, and vegetation and bird monitoring in areas where pesticides are being used and pesticides are not being used. So these are some of the main approaches that we use to mitigate impacts of pesticides on birds and biodiversity. If you have questions, you are very welcome. This is all what I present, and this is also a picture I took from Lake Hawassa some years back. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tadesse. That has been very informative, very educative, practical examples of where action is taking, and actually, apparently, you are realizing some results. You know, farmers are taking less and less of farm chemicals to their farms. That is really good. Please, participants, keep on sending your comments, questions on the chat box, and we'll be able to respond to them once we have the third presenter speaking to us. So I can see Stoyan is already has his presentation on. So Stoyan, please tell us more. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Dear colleagues, dear organizers, dear audience, many thanks for your attention. I would start with hugely acknowledge to the MSB project for giving me the opportunity to present our work on the Egyptian vulture and vultures in generally along the Flyway. I also thank Simon and Dr. Tadesse for providing a general overview about the problem. My talk will be mostly focused on our practical experience. So, actually, why exactly vultures? Unfortunately, still many people see the vultures as ugly and disgusting creatures because they are mostly associated with dead bodies and dirty places. However, it is totally opposite. Vultures are among the most amazing, interesting, and important birds on our planet. They are scavengers. They remove the dead bodies from the environment and thus stop the spread of diseases. In difference to the terrestrial carnivores or terrestrial scavengers, they don't have direct contact with other mammals because they live mostly on the high rocks or trees. So this is exactly how they implement their role. What is more, it is known that vultures have the strongest acidity of the gastric juice from the vertebrates, which practically kills all the pathogens they swallow. They also spend a lot of time of soaring or under the sunlight, and the UV light kills all the bacteria on their feathers, which is a specific approach to clean the feathers from the pathogens. It is also interesting that different species of vultures don't compete but complement each other in a perfect way. When a bird saw a dead body on the ground, it doesn't go to feed alone, but start to soar high into the sky, indicating that there is a food available. While there is a large group of vultures gathering, then they start to feed all together. Large species with strong bills feed on the muscles and skin. Long-necked species feed on the intestines, while smaller species with thinner bills feed on the small pieces around. Of course, there are species such as the lammergeier or bearded vultures, which feed on the bones. Practically nothing is left from the dead animal after the perfect cleanup crew function of the vultures. Of course, vultures have also a cultural value. They are deeply rooted in many myths and legends. There are a lot of associations linked to them. Some of them have been considered sacred birds into the past, and if somebody purchased them, it was he or she was punished death, because in the past people were strongly dependent on the livestock, and people knew about the role of vultures. If there is no livestock, there is not food for people, which is death for people. Unfortunately, with small exceptions, almost all around the world, vultures are in alarming status. They are declining. And to stop this decline at global level, there are different projects and programs. A very good example was given by Sayan's presentation. This is the multi-species action plan to conserve the Eurasian and African Old World vultures, which was developed by the Convention of the Migratory Species, and it was adopted in the Philippines 2017. This is a map from this document which shows the prioritization of different threats for vultures in different regions. As you can see, poisoning, and especially the use of poison baits, is considered the top threat for vultures all along the Red Sea Valley in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Horn of Africa. Poisons practically have different phases. They could be related to spraying of agricultural pesticides. They could be related to the illegal use of poison baits in relation to the human-carnivore conflict. These are also the toxic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs used in the veterinary practice. And last but not least, lead poisoning, which is coming from the hunt. Egyptian vulture is one of the species we are mostly working with, because this is the most threatened vulture in Europe. Over the last 50 years, the population declined with 50%. In the Balkans, in Southeastern Europe, the population declined with 80% over the last 30 years. And moreover, this is a migratory species, which covers more than 4,000 kilometers every spring and every autumn, migrating between the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds, crossing dozens of countries. To mitigate the decline and the threats which lead to decline, we analyzed the mortality causes, and we found that about 60% of the mortality was due to human-induced causes. And out of this 60% of human-induced mortality, 80% was due to poisoning. I will illustrate this better with an emblematic case from the Balkans, the story of Lazarus. Lazarus is one of the few individuals left in central Greece, subject of monitoring. In 2012, the pair was observed successfully arriving on the nest, but soon after, both birds disappeared. And a local shepherd found one of the birds is in really poor condition. toxicological analysis proved that the bird was poisoned. And after recovery, the bird was deployed with satellite transmitter. It spent all the summer around its nest. Due to the low number of individuals, it could not form a pair and successfully migrated in the winter to Chad. Next spring, in 2013, the bird was flying so fast, only for 2 weeks, it's covered 4,000 kilometers to come back to the nest. And we were so passionate that the bird will return and form hopefully a pair again. But once the bird reached Greece, it was poisoned again. And unfortunately, this time the poisoning was deadly. It was a very good example that a single bird could be poisoned twice. It's provided a very good insight about the magnitude of this threat in the Balkans. Investigating more deeply the roots of this problem, this originates from the human-wildlife conflicts. As mentioned in Sayan's presentation, livestock keepers try to decrease the rate of attacks from terrestrial carnivores on their livestock by using illegal methods like poison baits. Unfortunately, a lot of wildlife is subject of secondary poisoning. These are the avian scavengers such as vultures, eagles and other raptors, ravens, crows, and a lot of other animals. But we also found that in some countries like Greece, this problem transformed into a new dimension, human-human conflicts. For instance, shepherds are poisoning for wolves, but hunting dogs become poisoned. Then hunters would like to venge into shepherds and poison shepherd's dog. In this way, actually, it becomes as a vicious circle which can never end. On the figure, you can see that over the last years, hundreds of vultures have been poisoned in Greece together with many other raptors. And you can see that currently the most common reason for use of poison baits, which is totally illegal, was stated as a human dispute. Another good story to tell is the emblematic case of Vesal. It is an Egyptian vulture again, which was rescued in 2019 in Jordan. It was taken from a private zoo due to poor condition it was kept in. It was saved by the Jordanian BirdLife partner, deployed with a satellite transmitter and released in Dana Reserve. The bird successfully migrated to Ethiopia in the Afar Triangle in the Somali region. Unfortunately, it was there where it found poison and it became dead. The Ethiopian BirdLife partner immediately went to the site and discovered the remains of the bird, also discovered other dead bodies of Egyptian and other vultures. And this is how, for first time, we proved actually poisoning for Ethiopia for vultures. It was, we work in Ethiopia since 2013 very intensively, and it was really very hard to identify poisoning. I mean, real evidence. What is very characteristic for poisoning is that it is very hard to identify and it is very hard to find the victims. This is why we call it the silent killer. The Ethiopian BirdLife partner started to investigate deeper the issue with poisoning in the area, and we found that actually the alien plant Prosopis uliflora stimulate the use of poison baits in the pastoral areas. This plant was introduced to slow down the desertification, but it's grow very fast, covering large areas of pasture lands, and in the same time creating shelter for terrestrial predators, facilitating them to attack livestock. In the same time, it jeopardized the typical measures such as the shooting on carnivores, which forced the livestock breeders to use alternative methods to shooting, such as the poisoning. About 200 interviews have been conducted in the area by Ethiopian Wildlife and Natural History Society, which revealed that the most common problem livestock keepers face are actually the predation for hyenas, feral dogs, wolves, and so on. And poisoning was stated as the second method to mitigate this problem after the shooting, which is really very concerning. Another issue related to the dog poison, another issue related to the use of poison baits is the control of feral dog population. This was mentioned in Dr. Tadas's presentation. An emblematic case is the campaign in Ethiopian capital in 2013, when for about 1 month, over 12,000 dogs have been poisoned with strychnine. The problem in this case is that is the management of the dead bodies. Many of the dead dogs have been disposed at the rubbish dumps, which in Ethiopia and other similar countries are really full of vultures, which patrol there to look for food, together with other avian scavengers, such as ibises, eagles, and so on, which can lead to a real catastrophe. We have also evidence about such practices implemented in other countries, such as Lebanon and Egypt, but with other substances. In the case of Lebanon, this was lanat metumil, the other substance, but again, very toxic for vultures and which can cause secondary poisoning, which means that management of dead bodies is really very important. What can be the consequences of bad management of the dead bodies if they are not buried or burnt and so on? In the 90s, in the Balkans, just a single poisoning accident killed 60% of the national population of Egyptian vultures in northern Macedonia. And until now, this population cannot really recover. This was a case of few poisoned dogs deposed to rubbish dumps where a lot of vultures was regularly feeding. So a single accident can really destroy a population at a national level. We also found evidence of use of poison baits as a common practice in Saudi Arabia, in areas of congregation of Egyptian vultures and other raptors, such as the globally endangered steppe eagle. Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Middle East, and it is a migration bottleneck site, hosting and sheltering a large number of species and large number of individuals. This is why it's really very important that good practices take place and avoid practices such as the use of poison baits and other methods which can kill birds. On the photos, these are hyenas, which we found the hyenas were not target, so the target was the wolf, but hyenas was poisoned instead the wolf. But again, they can cause secondary poisoning. Another phase of the poisoning are the veterinary medical products, which are toxic for vultures. More specifically, these are the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Diclofenac is a very common example. For 20 years, because of the widespread of diclofenac as a painkiller and anti-inflammatory drug in India and South Asia in general, for the cattle, over 40 million vultures have been poisoned. And this is an unprecedented case of crash of population of vertebrates nowadays. A lot of species are really at the brink of extinction with very few individuals left. So they have been really millions. The ground, the roofs were black of vultures, and now there's nothing. This led to a lot of secondary problems, such as the rabies, attacks of some large predators, entrance of large predators, terrestrial predators in the cities, a lot of hepatitis B and other diseases which are bring from the mammals. Another similar substances which are toxic are aceclofenac, ketoprofen, fluoxetine, and others, which have the similar effect. Actually, diclofenac and similar substances block the function of kidneys and result in quick death in vultures and other birds. What was interesting is that recently diclofenac have been evidenced to be toxic not only for vultures, but for other birds of prey, such as the globally endangered steppe eagle. And it is important to mention that in the frame of the Egyptian Vulture New Life project, we conducted surveys in the Middle East, and we found that diclofenac is freely available for veterinary use in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. And especially for Saudi Arabia, it is worth to mention that this year, the world's largest congregation site of steppe eagles during the winter was found near Riyadh with over 6,000 individuals spending the winter there. Of course, during migration, the number is much higher. What is more, it is common that the dead livestock, which is potentially treated with diclofenac or other NSAIDs, is abandoned into the nature, which is food freely available or diclofenac freely available to scavenging birds. In Jordan, it was also found that diclofenac is manufactured for export for other countries, which is also a very serious concern. Insecticide spraying is another issue which affects vultures besides the passerine birds in the agricultural areas. In 2019, we tagged with satellite transmitters 15 Egyptian vultures in Afar area, Ethiopia, in the wintering grounds, to study their movements and factors of mortality. One of those birds went to breed in Saudi Arabia, and actually this is the only known case in the last 10 years of evidence of breeding of Egyptian vultures in the country. Unfortunately, the next year, this bird was found dead close to the nest by the Saudi Wildlife Authority, and the suspected reason of death was exactly spraying with agricultural pesticides for locusts in the area. So practically the only known breeding pair of this global endangered species was killed and destroyed by this agricultural practice. We also conducted legislative analysis about the pesticides and veterinary medical products in the Middle East, thanks to the great collaboration of the local partners, and we found some common features. Generally, the legislation for the pesticides is quite strict, but there are a lot of legislative gaps allowing the use of toxic veterinary medical products for scavenging birds in the veterinary medical practice. We also found that almost everywhere there is a poor implementation of the legislation. There is no control on the import, export, storage, or the use. And there is quite low level of awareness. And there is no much publicly available information with what is legal, what is not legal, what can be the consequences for the users. What we identified from the practical perspective in terms of the needs is better coordination between different ministries and authorities, ban the use of veterinary medical products which are toxic for vultures and other scavenging birds, and substitution them with safe alternatives such as meloxicam, and better control on the private company and distributions. Last but not least, there is an urgent need of well-targeted information campaigns in terms of increasing capacity of the relevant authorities and in terms of aware the users, which are the livestock breeders or farmers, about the potential consequences of the misuse of pesticides and dangerous veterinary medical products. Allow me to provide you with some examples from our area, although it's out of the Rift Valley in Southeastern Europe, to mitigate the use of poison baits, which is totally illegal. We work with the authorities to give strength to the legislation. We develop roadmaps. We create task forces or working groups. So far, these have been proven to work quite well because these involve the authorities in the solution, in the decision-making, in implementation. We also create series of training seminars for the authorities to increase their capacity. We help to exchange experience between different countries. And we also apply direct prevention measures such as alternatives to the use of poisons to decrease the rate of attacks from the terrestrial carnivores, such as we distribute local guarding dogs, which can protect the livestock. We distribute fences like electric fences or floodlights or foxlight, which can limit the attacks. We also create local networks of supporters, people who generally support us and work as ambassadors at local level. And we work with local schools, children, and we also work with media to develop awareness campaigns. And of course, we are very open to learn This is really very important to learn from those who know more. I can confess that most of what we do here in the Balkans, we adopted from Spain or from Hungary. For the diclofenac, the best example is South Asia. Actually, there is a lot of experience there, and what I know, that the best solution is to find safe alternatives, and also to limit and to modify the production of diclofenac, which is generally produced for the human medicine, and it's misused in the vet medicine. To change the production and manufacturing in a way that it will be hard or very expensive to be used in the vet medicine. I would like to hugely acknowledge the great work of all 20 partners along the Flyway, without which these results and knowledge will not be possible, and specifically our partners in the Middle East, which are BirdLife Middle East, Royal Society of Conservation of Nature in Jordan, Nature Conservation Egypt, Syrian Society of Conservation of Wildlife, Saudi Wildlife Authority, and specifically Dr. Shobrak, and of course, the great collaboration with the Migratory Soaring Bird Project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stoyan. Yeah, when Stoyan starts, presenting, he does it in a very passionate way, and I I really like listening to him on and on, as long as he's talking about the very passionate project and work that they are doing at BSPB. So that was the last of our speakers, and yeah, my internet seems to be. I hope you can see me. Please keep the comments coming. Comments. I'll perhaps, because I'm still holding the mic, I will field some few questions to the speakers, and I mean, a lot of all the speakers are talking about really a very passionate subject. Agriculture is about biodiversity, is about people, and I mean, when, for example, you start it becomes all of a sudden in most question, or the big question is agriculture, which is a primary, and the subject is likely to dominate most of the other aspects of human development. Agricultural production systems move towards some balance, which, I mean, a balance which guarantees food to the people, and the balance that so I would like the first speaker really to help us analyze this issue, look into this issue. How can we really meaningfully move from, unsustainable agriculture to sustainable agriculture, and at the same time feeding the people?
Hi, Alex. I only caught some of that, but I'm happy to answer the question. So I think the gist of the question was around how we balance the kind of production side of agriculture and its role in food production for people, and also protecting migratory birds at the same time. So I think when I see this as kind of things that aren't mutually exclusive. So I think you can protect birds while carrying out a very productive kind of agricultural system as well. So it's about changing behavior. So if, for example, if you're using pesticides to protect your crops, you can make somewhat kind of small changes that will have a big impact on migratory birds and minimizing the risks to them. So for example, if you're applying pesticides, kind of timing that in the right way, so that you avoid kind of peak migratory or peak times when the migratory birds are using your fields, or you avoid using it in particular kind of bottleneck areas or sites. And I mean, sharing this information, I think, is one of the key ways that us as NGOs and kind of the government can enable farmers and other companies in terms of understanding the kind of the flyways and the different kind of important kind of timing wise when these birds are in the area, and how they can plan their kind of cropping schemes around that. And then it's also, I think, about other small things that farmers could do, as if you're using if one of the birds in your area is a grain feeder, for example, you just change your pesticide type, so that's not in kind of granular form, or a seed-based treated seed. So you're making these kind of little changes. Of course, there's the wider kind of integrated pest management and the more ecosystem-based approaches as well, and these are helpful as well, because they address the ecosystem, and the ecosystem provides services to people. So you get cleaner water, you're less likely to have runoff and everything like that. You're less likely to have desertification, and the ecosystem can keep producing and supporting those crops for a longer period of time while protecting the health of people.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I hear better coordination, adoption of better systems like integrated pest management. Issues to address in terms of moving agricultural productivity to sustainability. Thank you, Simon. I would like to ask Dr. Tadesse to actually reflect on the the trends in the amounts of pests used in the future look like. Are we steering? We are using more and more of pesticide activity at the national level. Tadesse.
Yes, thank you, Alex. There are endeavors of policy frameworks in Ethiopia that provide the use of agroecological solutions and approaches in the agriculture system. But the way I see it, the emergence of different existing and new migratory pests in Ethiopia and Africa is obliging the government to use more pesticides. For example, the lowest occurrence this time, it's nearly 1 year, the pesticide application is going really up. Quelea bird is the other one, and a new pest for the whole of Africa is the American fall armyworm, which is also a challenge. Even pesticides cannot manage them so far. It's only mechanical means that are being used, and the main approach that's also promoted is a prevention mechanism. But all these things are really giving the option for high amount of pesticide use. But as I said, we are also part of the international policy, in the international policy negotiations. In the FAO and WHO joint meeting for pesticide management, we are trying to have even a legally binding mechanism to end and phase out the use of highly hazardous pesticides. They have their own criteria: hazardous for wildlife, hazardous for human beings, the environment. So these highly hazardous pesticides should be phased out. This is one of the things that I am personally also pushing at the UN level. And in Ethiopia, there is a revision of the Ethiopian agriculture policy, and I was part of that process. And we are pushing for the incorporation of a provision for agroecological solutions like IPM, biological control mechanisms, and to the extreme, the provision for organic agriculture. And Ethiopia has an organic agriculture proclamation. There is a provision of organic agriculture implementation, and there are in bits and pieces the implementation of organic agriculture. And as you see, the international demand for organic is high. Our coffee is organic. Much of our coffee is organic. Sesame organic, but it is restricted to export items. But we are pushing that not only for export, but nationally there is a need for organic agriculture. So there are two ways: the migratory pest, which is really pushing on the other side, and the international demand and the national request on organic agriculture. So it's going hand in hand, but currently it's increasing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, That's very informative. It's sad to hear that agrochemicals are increasing, but very nice efforts there to control the use of chemicals, to have less and less of use of chemicals in Ethiopia, which is very encouraging. And I think if we have this kind of effort being applied in the region, then we are looking at a more sustainable future. Please allow me to quickly go back to our third speaker, who is Stoyan. And Stoyan, I mean, in Ethiopia, you give a very good example of the invasive species is actually helping helping in the widespread abuse of agrochemicals to fight predators. I mean, how can we actually join hands, especially in this part of the world, to to ensure that we have government input into the control of predators, and how do we manage the whole issue where the abuse is actually being complicated by the emergence of which, in my view, actually the government helped, to bring into the country to control the certification?
Many thanks, Alex, for this question. To be honest, I'm not an expert about the mitigation measures to limit the spread of prosopis as an invasive plant. As I know, there have been very intensive programs, different suggestions tested, and so far there is no single solution. Probably Dr. Tadesse can also help with the answer, but what I can tell in terms of the poisoning is that, and especially concerning vultures and other scavenging birds, is that as we know, there is data that vultures consume 70% of the carcasses in the wild. And killing vultures, even they're not a target as the hyenas or lions and so on, livestock keepers actually remove this very important keystone in the ecosystem in order, and they help and stimulate the spread of diseases in these areas, especially in Ethiopia. We don't have any evidence about the impact of diclofenac or other NSAIDs in the veterinary practice, so we don't consider this as an issue, especially in the remote areas, which means that vultures are one of the tools to control the spread of diseases in these semi-desert areas. And if this component of the ecosystem is removed, there could be an additional negative impact on the livestock with high mortality due to different diseases. I don't think that so far there have been some efforts to provide alternatives to poisoning. The only way we know is shooting, which is a traditional method, but obviously in the bush, it's not appropriate. So I think this is something where we should dig very intensively together with the local NGOs and authorities in future. And we are very open to help with. Another aspect of this problem, besides the livestock and besides the vultures, are the human conflicts, because prosopis as an invasive plant take huge areas of pasture lands, and actually very few animals can graze on these shrubs because they have pines. As I know, the cattle don't feed on these shrubs, and this reduce the area of pasture lands, which actually increase the conflict between different tribes. As we know, in the area in Afar, for instance, there is a conflict between Somali people and Afar people. It's like a war for the pasture lands, and for sure this is stimulated through the spread of prosopis. So there is also a very important human aspect of this problem, not only vultures.
Great. Thank you very much, Stoyan, for that comprehensive answer. Stoyan's talked a lot about your country. Do you want to chime in?
Excuse me, I'm not sure if I heard the question.
No, sorry, I'm actually speaking to Tadesse. Tadesse, if you can still hear me. Do you have anything to add to what Stoyan has talked about agrochemical use for predators in the areas which are being invaded by the prosopis in Ethiopia?
Not really. I mean, pesticide use for this is not much reported in these areas. As far as my knowledge is concerned, and there are applications in bits and pieces, but not so much utilized. They use rifles for management of predators most of the time. But I cannot say that there are in bits and pieces application of these types of chemicals as baits.
Right. Thank you. Now, you mentioned a very practical case where you are getting less and less of chemicals being used by the farmers in one of your project areas. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a very positive story, I think, which should be emulated across the board. And you within your project, you see any opportunities of accelerating, the results of what you are doing within the Rift Valley to other, either through the government or through other mechanisms across, because this is really useful and everybody would like to see happening. I mean, less and less affecting even humans, to humans, and also to the killing, especially the photos that you showed us of non-targeted species.
Yeah, in the Ethiopian condition,
Over
when
to
we
you.
are working, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
In the Ethiopian condition, in the Ethiopian condition, we NGOs are working in tripartite agreement with the government. So mainly we are working for these issues, for pesticides issues and agriculture issues. We are working with the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and also with the local agriculture departments. So we were trying to influence policy from top down, but that type of influence was very difficult to influence the policy from up, from the federal level. So instead of doing that, while not stopping that, we started working with the grassroots farmers and started from the bottom to influence the policy up. Now, the government endorsed our approach, and from time to time, there are demands from neighboring villages and neighboring regions, and the experience from the cotton project is now being adopted for vegetable in the central Ethiopian Rift Valley area. The main challenge, though, is as we are NGOs, it is fund-based, and with the COVID impact with donors and with the donor limitation on these aspects, we couldn't go as far as we want to expand it. Otherwise, there are still demands. We are going to expand the vegetable work in the central Ethiopian Rift Valley area, and the cotton work is also being expanded. So the government is endorsing, and if you go to the net and if you say organic cotton production, the first thing that will pop up is Pan Ethiopia's project in Arba Minch area, in the southern Ethiopian area, and the government is also proud of this. This has two advantages. The first one is the human health impact in those areas and the environmental impact. The witnesses that we got from those people in that area is one of the women farmers was saying, in earlier times when we have arguments with our children, sometimes they go to the stores and they take pesticides and they commit suicide. But now we stop using pesticides and we can quarrel easily because they don't have access to pesticides and we are saved. This is one example that can be even mentioned. The other thing is with organic, from the industry perspective, there is a belittling need of saying organic is for small, not really for large, and the yield is compromised. But in our case, yield is more than doubled, and the premium for organic cotton is also very high, 15%. So there is increase in yield, and also there is increase in price of cotton, and the confidence of the farmers in the value chain also increases. So the government appreciated this, and it is being adopted. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tadesse. We have a couple of questions and comments. One of the comments is to congratulate all the speakers. The presentations have been very inspirational. But there is one question from one of the participants who is checking whether there is a known safe insecticide for birds of prey, you know, and whether also there is a guideline developed as part of mitigation measure by any partner. Can I check who will be in a position? Stoyan, do you think you can tackle this?
Many thanks, Dr. Shubrak, for your question. Actually, I know for such solution only the level of control for the feral dog populations. This is a drug which, this is a substance, agricultural substance, which doesn't cause secondary poisoning. So practically it kills dogs, but doesn't kill birds of prey or avian scavengers. This is the zinc cyanide. But also there's issues in terms of the way of killing. As I know, it's very harmful for dogs to use such a substance. So it's not an easy task to take a decision. I don't also feel myself as an expert to suggest decisions. So absolutely, your question is very well positioned, and we need all together to dig into and find solutions. But from our perspective, what is important is to also to consider the timing, the timing of the use of pesticides. So for instance, if pesticides are used during early spring when some birds are not present in the area, or somehow used in a controlled way with very specific concentrations and so on, without some part of the substance disposed in the area and freely available to birds. This could be a mitigation. For instance, from our perspective in Bulgaria, pesticides are widely used, but one of the problems is that the packages and some remaining quantities are just abundant on the fields with grains treated with pesticides, which are available food for carnivorous birds, which is a severe problem. Of course, all this is illegal, but there is no control. Also, we have buildings which are abandoned and full of huge quantities of pesticides, which is something which should be resolved years ago from the government, but still it's a pending issue. And we always sending complaints and pushing to solve this issue. Even recently, we had an issue with a suggested change in the legislation of the hunting law, which was trying to suggest banned so far methods for hunting, not selective hunting, which includes all the restrictions and the different conventions, including use of poisons and traps and so on, which is a severe problem. So always we should be very careful about what is going on around us. Many thanks.
Thank you, Stoyan. And we are slowly coming to the end of this webinar. It has been a very wonderful session with to have you all of you on board. I think the topic that we've discussed is something touches the hearts and businesses of many people. Everyone has to eat, and I think the most important thing is to perhaps check. I mean, to think about whenever you're having a meal, to think about those birds that might have been killed in the effort to deliver food on the table. But all the same, there seems to be quite nice, efforts that are working across the region. We have a guideline for the region with very nice proposals on what needs to be done. We seem to have very practical examples that are happening within the region on how the chemicals can actually be reduced. Why do we have to do the quelea sprays and locust sprays when it is a peak migration season for the migratory species? So, I mean, we have plenty of options. And one of the speakers talked about coordination. I think it is very hard for us to succeed without coordinated effort. We need especially the authorities, the governments to be at the center of the efforts to practice sustainable agriculture. And we need donors in the play to ensure that we have resources that help to accelerate the nice lessons, to replicate the nice lessons going forward. And who knows, in some few years to come, we'll be having a very safe passage of migratory birds crossing between Africa and Eurasia in a very smooth way, very minimal effects from agriculture moving forward. So I don't want to take more of your time, and I wanted to ask to quickly go to the closing moments of this webinar.
Alex?
And yes, please, Stoyan.
If you allow me, because there is one additional question in the chat, which is really very important, if you allow me to answer.
I see. Oh, please do. Is the one that asked by Mohammed Shobrak?
Yeah. Many thanks, Dr. Shobrak. You always pose the right questions on the right moment. This is a very tricky issue and a very important issue to increase the capacity of the authorities and the experts to make the analysis. So in terms of the poisoning, because I know you're specifically interested on the impact on birds of prey, identification is very important. What helps a lot in Europe is the anti-poison canine teams. These are specifically trained dogs to find poison. So they increase tremendously the probability to find poison baits. This is useful for the investigation purposes, like evidence in the court, because use of poison bait is a crime. And on the other hand, they have prevention impact because they remove hundreds of poison baits per year from the wild, which are potentially mortality factors for birds of prey. Still, we face the same challenges, good toxicological labs to investigate and conduct toxicological analysis. For instance, in our region, we have very few such labs, and sometimes it's a challenge to transport the samples from country to country. Sometimes the samples are the whole bodies and so on. So what can be a short-term decision is to identify good experts in your countries which are well motivated to develop their capacity and send them to trainings abroad. For instance, we are sending our experts in trainings in Spain or Hungary, in countries which have this capacity and have the knowledge to share. This is very useful, and once these experts come back to your country, they can transfer this knowledge. Of course, a lot of funding is needed to have a really well-equipped lab because the consumables are very expensive. And finally, it's also a challenge. Once you have the analysis and everything, you need to have the needed capacity and understanding from the police and the court in order to proceed with the case into the court, because I can share with you that still we don't have a lot of finalized cases in the Balkans in the court, while we have hundreds of cases per year of use of poison bait. So it's a real challenge to have a finalized case, and people can actually with implied penalties and so on, or into the jail, depending on the crime, because it's a crime, use of poison baits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stoyan, and thank you very much again, Mohammed Shobrak, for asking very, very relevant questions in a timely manner. we are happy to have you on this webinar. So moving forward, I would like to invite Osama. Osama is the project coordinator for the MSB project, which has been funded by UNDP GEF, and which supported us to have this call. Welcome, Osama.
Thank you very much. I feel like it is coming towards the end of the party. Dear guests have departed and we have only members of the family around, which make it a very relaxed atmosphere to give some final quick comments. Thank you everybody for attending this. Obviously within the MSB project, we have an undertake and we have a responsibility to support the uptake of what was discussed today. We will continue hopefully to proceed into ensuring the enabling of the enforcement of the existing legislative frameworks. We will eventually go ahead checking into the agricultural, national and regional work plans and strategies in the countries in the region and ensure that those concerns are mainstreamed well within the agricultural policies. And we will also ensure that whenever possible and with the help of all, to ensure that those agricultural, national and regional projects and agricultural schemes are really implementing the recommendations that were given there. Of course, there will be and there will continue to be direct collaboration with many of you, I hope, and we are open to all initiatives in the region. We are looking in particular for the information of you on opportunities in specific countries. I would like to mention two in particular, Sudan and Ethiopia, and where existing effort is happening now in Sudan, especially with the Plant Protection Directorate, that they have just finished the spraying in Sudan, and we are hopefully on the ground checking on the results on birds and checking their practices. We are also hoping that we will expand this discussion. Dr. Desse started now on Ethiopia. Hopefully we will end up with a roundtable at the national level for Ethiopia and for Sudan to incorporate those questions and go ahead with the work forward. I'm happy that good examples are also taking place by the project in Lebanon through the mirroring the experiences of the local management of natural resources through the revival of Hima farm concepts into specific areas of land. And the capacity in the region is a very high issue, and I'm very happy that this was raised, and we will ensure that we find ways with all of you to collaborate on those issues. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you also, Shannon, for just also putting the website of the Migratory Soaring Birds. We're happy to be contacted directly ourselves as well to ensure that the bridges we need with all of you are in place to proceed. And I'm sorry that Nicola left, but I am sure that I would like to pass the message of our international policy teams who are kindly undertaking the issue of the global aspect of this work. As we have just heard from Simone, that the task force or working group on agricultural issues are in the making with the CMS. And we are very happy also to have this in collaboration with any of the country's parties who would like to know more about this. And I'm sure our policy team is also happy to proceed with those contacts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex, for organizing this and facilitating the discussion for all those who have attended. And back to you, Alex. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Osama. Just to reiterate that the recordings of this webinar will be available very soon on our project website. Please keep visiting. The website is also very rich in terms of other work that BirdLife is actually undertaking through the MSB project. So, and thank you very much again for finding time to be on this call. And I'll see you again. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.